Well, welcome everybody. Um, I've done two messages on responding to enemies, and I've done some more, and so that's what we're gonna continue. And tonight, as a forewarned, is going to be super, super, super simple. So I hope I don't bore you. But we're going to be continuing with responding to enemies and looking at the topic of strangers. Um, and we'll get that started in just a moment. But let's have a word of prayer first. Lord, we're thankful that we can gather together here and read from the word that was given to us, that was written down by your apostles, people who followed you, people who tried to know you and who you were, and people that got to walk with your son while he was on this earth. And hopefully we could take from the things that they wrote and their experiences and translate them into our lives as we walk each day for the same purpose that they walked each day, which is to glorify you and to spread your word and let or let you show people who you are through us. We ask these things and your blessings in your son's name, amen. All right, so we're going to start the night, and tonight, just so you know, is going to be like every other night. I got a lot of different scriptures, and I have them on the screen in front of me. I'm going to read them. You can certainly turn if you're a speed turner. I might pause a couple times, give you a chance to get to some of them, but we're going to start off with the heading of strangers. And the strangers is not, the strangers we're going to talk about is not the stranger that's walking down the street. It's ourselves. And the first scripture I want to go to is Psalm 119 and verse 19. Now, if you read around this and read the whole passage, which I'm not going to do, the context is somebody saying that they're a stranger, but at the same time, they feel they're a stranger. They're looking for God to stay with them, and they're looking for God to keep His commandments in their heart, so they can walk with Him and be with Him, even though they feel like they are a stranger. So the verse says, "I am a stranger in the earth. Do not hide your commandments from me." So the first thing is that David is not the author of this psalm. And we know, hopefully, that David is not the author of all the psalms, although usually people would say that he is probably, most people will probably think he wrote most of them. This psalm was probably written, some commentators say Ezra, others say even further after that in some post-kingdom exilic poet may have written it. So, first clue would be David wasn't a stranger. He had a kingdom. So he had a place on this earth that he was not necessarily a stranger, but the exiles did not, and they felt they were strangers. And so that's the first place I want to go to that might indicate that we too are strangers. The next one is John 17:16. My dad has been doing some things out of John. So we've probably heard this verse a couple times over a couple different weeks. But in this verse, and again, verses around it, in context, Jesus is praying, and he's talking to God, his Father, and asking the things of God that he would have for his disciples and what his disciples are going to be doing, and that he's going to be leaving, but they're not leaving. He's leaving the world, they're staying in the world for a certain purpose. And he says they are not of the world, even as I am not of the world. So it's probably not hard to understand, knowing who Jesus was, that he really wasn't of the world. He was Christ. He was the incarnation, and he was here on this earth for a particular reason, or multiple reasons perhaps, and he wasn't of the earth. But so he's equating his disciples to himself as he's not of the world, neither are they. And of course, we know they were here for a reason. 1 John 2:15-16, it says, "Do not love the world, nor the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, and the lust of the eyes, and the boastful pride of life, is not from the Father, but is from the world." When John says flesh here, he's using that same word that we talked about quite a while ago now, being sarx. Flesh, not my skin, not my body, but that which makes up part of me that is attached to the world. That's the sarx. It's flesh. It has fleshly desires. It wants the things of the world. It doesn't necessarily want the things of God. And it's the thing that we would say, when you have a good angel on one shoulder, the bad angel on the other shoulder, that one is talking in your ear and the other is talking in your ear, and sometimes you end up following the wrong one. That would be the sarx. It desires things that are related to the old man, which for us is gone, and the world. Somewhere else, Jesus said that, you can't have both. You have one or the other. You can't serve two masters. You're going to hate one and love the other. And of course, we know that that's probably hyperbole, the part about hating one and loving the other. But the idea is that you're going to have one that you're really, truly going to follow. And that is the idea here that Jesus wants, and that John's trying to get across with what he's saying. You're either going to have the love of the Father in you, or you're going to have the love of the world in you. And if you have any love of the world, it's constantly going to be pulling you away and pulling you away. And the overarching idea that we're talking about in this series is nonviolence. The not violence, not nonviolence, nonviolence. Violence is a way of the world. When John says the boastful pride of life, the pride of life is something that causes a lot of issues in the world today. It often can be the base of what starts violence. Same thing goes with the lust of the flesh and the lust of the eyes. You see things, you want it. Some people will resort to extreme measures to get it. And sometimes we do things en masse as nations or cultures or societies or what have you. And then oftentimes when it happens at that level, it seems to be accepted as it's okay, but it's of the world. So there are many, many other passages that talk about who we are or who we're not being part of the world. But we do belong to something or to someone, right? We are strangers here in the world, and we'll see some more verses about that in a little bit, but we're here. We're strangers here. We're aliens here, or we should be anyways. And we're that way because there's someplace else where we belong. We're not just walking aimlessly. You don't believe in God and then just walk around with no purpose because he's taking you out of the world. There's still a purpose and a belonging that you have. And if you turn to Ephesians 2, and we're going to look at verses 19 to 22. And Paul says, "So then you are no longer strangers and aliens, but you are fellow citizens with the saints and are of God's household, having been built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Christ Jesus himself being the cornerstone, in whom the whole building, being fitted together, is growing into a holy temple in the Lord, in whom you also are being built together into a dwelling of God in the Spirit. So we know in this passage, Paul's talking about two different groups of people. They're coming together, but to one group or the other, to the one group he's saying that he's writing to, you're no longer estranged from these folks, just like they're no longer estranged from you. You're together. You're not walking aimlessly. God didn't pull you out of the world for no reason. He put you together, and you belong to his household. That's your belonging now, to God's household, and you are built on something that started with Jesus and spread out. That was the base. Jesus was the base, and then the others built on top, as Paul talks about in Corinthians. And so this building, or the thing that's being built together, is a temple. And it's a place where the Spirit of God, where God dwells within us. But he says we are not strangers and aliens from each other as saints or from God. We have become citizens, fellow citizens with all saints, and part of God's household. We could say in that we are citizens of his kingdom. And this is where we must or have to live in our hearts, our minds, our attitudes, our conversation, in everything that we do and that people see us do and that we talk about, and the way we live. It's got to be different than what the world is. You were pulled out of the world. If you continue living in the world, and this goes beyond, getting drunk, smoking cigarettes, or what have you that you think are sins, watching dirty movies, all that stuff, that's true. But a lot of people don't do those things. Now I look at sins, like what we call sins, like that, and I think about what Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount when he said, you can't just love like the world loves, because everybody does that, right? The Gentiles even do that. It has to be different. And so it goes beyond that, because a lot of people in the world don't do a lot of those things. And so what's the separation? That's what's important. So I'm going to read something to you. And this comes from a book called The Apostolic Fathers in English. And the section I'm going to read to you, I don't know if they're sections or chapters, but it's number 5, and it's called Christian Practices. I'm just going to not read the whole thing. I have some things highlighted to read from it. So the writer of this letter is anonymous. They gave themselves a name, and the name escapes me, Metellus or something like that, something like Matthew, or a derivative of Matthew, and not Matthew the Apostle. This was written sometime, they believe, around 130 AD, and it was written to a man named Diognetus. Diognetus, again, nobody knows exactly who he was. Could probably deduce, if you read more of it, some idea of who he was. I think they have some things about that in there. I didn't look at them, but I almost kind of think about it like Theophilus that Luke wrote to. There's somebody who wanted to know something, so someone wrote to them and let them know, like Luke gave him the history or what happened with Jesus, and then went on to also pen Acts to show how everything continued after Jesus went back up to the Father. So something similar. This guy Diognetus wanted to know more about Christians, so this person wrote, and he says the first thing he says is for Christians, neither by country or language or customs are distinguished from the rest of humanity. For they do not dwell somewhere in their own cities, nor do they use some strong language, nor do they practice a peculiar way of life. This teaching of theirs has not been found by any thought or reflection of inquisitive people, nor do they advocate human doctrine as some do. But while living in both Greek and barbarian cities, as each have attained by lot, I thought that was kind of neat. So not only are there civilized Christians in Greek cities, but there are uncivilized Christians in barbarian cities. Of course, just because it's barbarian at that time doesn't necessarily mean it was thought of as uncivilized completely, but they got it by lot, just by chance is where they were born. And it says they follow local customs, both in clothing and diet, and in the rest of life. They demonstrate the wonderful and most certainly strange character of their own citizenship. So he's telling Mr. Diognatus that just because they're here and they live in such and such a country and they dress the way those people dress and eat the same food they eat, they have a wonderful and strange character that comes from their own citizenship that sets them apart. He says that they live in their own countries, but as aliens. They share in everything as citizens and endure everything as foreigners. Every foreign country is their country, and every country is foreign. Every foreign country is their country. And every country is foreign. In other words, there's no country. And I think I've tried to say that in some different ways over the past several months. Being a citizen of God's kingdom doesn't mean Paul was a Roman citizen. And of course, he used his Roman citizenship to his advantage. As an American citizen, I've said this before, I would use being an American citizen to my advantage. I live here. I follow the laws. Whatever customs and our society demands. However, in the grand scheme of things, the world is not my country. And since no country in the world is actually my country, but the kingdom of God, then every country is foreign. It says they spend time upon the earth, but have their citizenship in heaven. They love all people, and by all people are persecuted. They are reviled, and they give blessing. They are insulted, and they give honor. And of course, we can think of Peter saying that about Jesus. Though he was reviled, he did not turn that back around on them and revile them back. It says a lot more things. It even talks about the warring of the Jews upon the Christians and the persecution that the Greeks give the Christians. But it says, even though they might be hated, they have no hate. And they have love. Then I just want to read the beginning of this letter. It says, since I perceive, most excellent Diognetus, that you are very eager to learn the religion of the Christians and are making altogether clear and careful inquiries about them, both what God they trust and how they worship him, so that they all both disregard the world and despise death, and they consider neither those supposed by the Greeks to be gods, nor do they observe the superstition of the Jews, and what is the deep affection they have for one another, and why then this new race or way of living has come to life now and not before. I also thought that was pretty neat. This new race. We're a new race. According to this anonymous person, that's how they put it. They're trying to say to Diognetus that Christian is completely different. And as I read more about the Christians in the Roman Empire and the world at that time, it seems to be that they were actually much more different than the Christians of today. Because if you're not out declaring yourself as a Christian or part of a large denomination and letting everybody know it, or doing something for denomination, people might not even know you're a Christian. But at that time, and I read to you, I think the last time we talked about a Roman general who was talking about the Christians that were serving but wouldn't kill, and so they were used in other ways, how impressed he was with how they conducted themselves. So it was something that was seen by others. They were very, very different. In Philippians 1:27, Paul says, only conduct yourselves in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ, so that whether I come and see you or remain absent, I will hear that you are standing firm in one spirit, with one mind, striving together for the faith of the gospel. Now, the reason I wanted to read this passage is due to a note that I found in the Net Bible. And the reason I tracked that down was because as I was looking at the different words in here in my interlinear, something about the word conduct kind of jumped out at me as far as the Greek. So the Greek word for conduct, I didn't write it down because I'm certainly not going to try to pronounce it to you. You could look it up, but it says the Greek word means to behave as a citizen. So Paul is not simply saying here, conduct yourselves in a manner worthy of the gospel. He's saying, conduct yourself or behave yourself like you are a citizen of the gospel of Christ, or a citizen, we could say, of the kingdom, or a citizen of God's household. You are to be walking like you are from a particular country, and that particular country is a heavenly country. We're to live as citizens, which is interesting. The city of Philippi was a Roman colony, and in this colony, many people who were Roman people in the Roman government, or retired Roman military men, retired to Philippi. It is estimated that about 30 to 40% of the church in Philippi were Roman citizens. Rome gave citizenship to many people in Philippi as it was a colony. And there were others that were waiting for that status, or desired to have that status, that lived there and may have applied for it in various ways. But Paul here, in so saying, is trying to tell them that you don't need that citizenship. And if you already have that citizenship, you shouldn't count it as something for yourself beyond, I live here on the world and I live here in Philippi, and Rome made me a citizen. He's not saying get rid of the citizenship or deny yourself the citizenship, but he's basically saying it doesn't matter. And if you don't have it, you don't need it. It's not necessary for what you are here for as a believer. It should be the bottom of the list of concerns. And the amazing thing about Philippians is, and those people that live in Philippi, is that a lot of the people that were the Roman citizens there were very patriotic people. They fought for the Roman government. They worked for the Roman government. They went on many battle campaigns. They did many things. It says the Caesars had many titles praised upon them, such as Lord, the Son of God, God, peace, justice. Those were the titles of Caesar. And any patriotic Roman, like many that lived in Philippi, would have viewed the Caesar as such and believed that. And so they found, many of these people found, any terms or things used by Christians, or that even speak of the gospel, or that there's another king, or that Jesus is the Son of God and that there's a God in heaven, were very offensive to them. They were very a very patriotic people. I think sometimes, at least when I've ever thought of Rome, I guess I've never thought that because, mostly I'm reading about Christians being persecuted by Rome and all the terrible things that Rome did, right? We read of some of their emperors who were not the best people, but I've almost learned to somewhat equate the patriotic American to the patriotic Roman. Some difference there in the way they see religion, but the idea behind what the patriotic or what that means, I think, is similar. And so some things in Philippians make a little more sense with that background and what he's saying. They're citizens of somewhere. There's another king. And to them, that would have been blasphemy or very uncomfortable, and certainly reason to persecute somebody. In Acts 17, 6 and 7, we remember that they're looking for Paul in his group as they're teaching, and they drag Jason, who had invited Paul to his house, and says that Paul and these disciples and apostles have come here and they're turning the world upside down, our world upside down by teaching the things they're teaching. And instead they bring Jason, and he gets the brunt of what happened. But they say in verse 7 that they all act contrary to the decrees of Caesar, saying that there is another king, Jesus. We know that the Jews were the ones who riled these crowds up, who were primarily Roman citizens, many Greek folks and others, but they were Roman citizens, and were probably proud Roman citizens, since they're saying that they've spoken against the decrees of Caesar, which tells me that they believe the decrees of Caesar, and they use that as a way that they lived and carried themselves. And to have someone like Paul or other people come in here and say that there's another King Jesus, of course the Jews didn't believe in Jesus, and they thought, well, this is great, we can make a bunch of trouble for them here too, which they did. Rome was the might and hope of the world, and the might rested on its military and its military conquests and policing of the empire and the rest of the known world. They branched themselves all the way up, even into England and out into Germany and other places, and even further east. I mean, the empire was big, and they had military actions and conquests throughout, and tried to spread the whole idea of what was behind Rome throughout. And so these people, embedded in them was, we're citizens of Rome. And what was the offense? The offense was that Paul brought a new religion. That wasn't the offense, because in Rome, even though Caesar declared himself to be a lord and a god and all that, they also had all kinds of other gods they worshipped. And there were other religions and other gods that were tolerated in the Roman Empire, such as the Greek gods, and even more than that. The Jews were tolerated in Rome until they, of course, started causing all kinds of problems. So it wasn't religion that bothered them. It was the fact that they were declaring that Jesus was the king. That's what drove these people mad, and that they said there's a different way to live after this other king. So we have a different king and a different kind of kingdom that has nothing to do with the world whatsoever. In 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 9, he says, but you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for God's own possession, so that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who has called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. We belong to God. We are his possession. We're a part of his household. We are a different nation that's been called out from among all other nations, out of darkness, which is the world, into his light. And I have to turn a light on here. It's getting a little dark in here. I hope that doesn't mess the video up. But we have a place of belonging. And I think that the apostles repeatedly make statements like this to make sure that we understand and that we live as a people who belong to a very different type of nation than any nation the world can create or establish. Peter says that's where we are. And the reason that we're there is to what? Proclaim the excellencies of him who has called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. We're there to proclaim and live the examples that God has given us. We're there to proclaim and live the things that Jesus taught. We're there to proclaim and live the things that Paul wrote about and Peter wrote about and the other apostles, John, that they wrote about of how we're supposed to live and be different than the world that we find ourselves in. Titus also says something, and I include Titus for those that might try to pigeonhole Peter's just to being to Jews. What did Titus say? He says in chapter 2 and verse 14, Jesus Christ gave himself for us to redeem us from every lawless deed and to purify for himself a people for his own possession, zealous for good deeds. I read the word zealous, and we think about Simon the Zealot and what the zealots were. They were the Jewish zealots were people that were extremely active against the Roman Empire, and I know I've talked about both Jesus and Paul saying, "Stop being zealous against the Roman Empire. It's not what you're here for. It's not what we need." And it's no different today. But zealousness for good deeds, zealousness to proclaim the excellencies of God, the excellencies of his kingdom, a zealous way of life, so zealous that when people look at us, it's like the apostle who wrote to Diognetus that says they're so different that when you see them, you'll know. Unfortunately, today, when I listen to different radio programs, Christian radio stations, sometimes I turn it on and I think the things that they say and their preaching or the shows they have on, like, I feel like almost when I see things online that Christians today are more zealous for a worldly system than they are for the kingdom of God, which is unfortunate. Peter also says in chapter 2, which we were just in of First Peter, but he says, "Beloved," in verse 11, "I urge you as aliens and strangers to abstain from fleshly lusts which wage against the soul." As aliens and strangers. I think the ESV maybe, or the King James Version says we're sojourners. We're travelers. We're in the world. We're here in whatever kingdom or nations that we live in. And we try to live peacefully so that we can live among the world and show them what a better way of life is, what a better attitude about life is, a better way of relationships with other people is. When we view other people, a better way to view other people, regardless of who they are. Like Paul said a couple times, there's no more slave, there's no more free, there's no more man, there's no more woman, there's no more barbarians, there's no more anything. There is people who don't believe and people who believe, and the ones that believe, they can't see those things. Because as soon as they start seeing those things and categorizing people and separating people, then they've just defeated what the gospel is about. And so in that way, also, we are sojourners and aliens, hopefully. In John 18, we were just in John 17 recently, but in 1836, it says, Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then my servants would be fighting so that I would not be handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not of this realm." If Jesus' kingdom is not of this world, and Jesus doesn't want his servants fighting to free him, and if there's any type of suffering going on of Christians and persecution, yeah, if you read more of that letter to Diognetus, it talks about that, the persecutions that they were enduring, and they didn't fight it. They just kept living and kept teaching and kept preaching, no matter what happened to them. They suffered for it, and that also set them apart. There wasn't a fight. There wasn't a fight for Jesus as he was being handed over, because his kingdom is not of this world. If his kingdom's out of this world, then my kingdom's not of this world, because I'm in his kingdom. And how do I know that? Well, we'll read in a minute. Actually, we'll read it right now, then we're pretty much going to wrap it up here. But I think that other verses that guide us in this direction are asking us to ask ourselves, as individuals, am I part of the world? What is it of this world that's got a hold on me? And of course, I said there's sins, but I think Jesus has more in mind often than sins. I think he has in mind also, as we read what Paul talks about in Romans 12 and 13, and Jesus talks about in the Sermon on the Mount, we have the ideas of worldly powers and our connection to them. And what is it about those powers that's driving us? Our zealousness for them. The fact, I think I said last time we spoke, I said that, there's the Christian right that I used to think I belonged to a long time ago, but now I understand. To me, I understand through these studies that I've been doing that I shouldn't be looking to belong to something like that, because the whole point of the Christian right is its attachment to a worldly power. And unfortunately, many that belong to that are extremely zealous for that worldly power and link Christ to that worldly power. Not that they're saying Jesus is part of that worldly power, but, well, these people are the right people. These people are the good people. And we pull things out of the Bible and say, this is why they're the right people. This is, I've heard it on the radio. I listened to a common radio preacher, and one of the shows they were talking about, and they happened to be talking about other forms of government and why the capitalist government was correct and biblical. And they were going back and forth, and the caller was trying to say it the other way around, and they were convinced that being a Republican capitalist was the godly side to be on. And to me, it doesn't have to be that way to you, and I'm speaking to you, things that I'm looking at. To me, it shouldn't be that way. There should be nothing. Of course, there are things on both sides of the American government that we could go to the Bible and say, see, there are things that you could take out of any government. Even evil governments that have little things here and there, you might be able to say, well, at least they got that part right. I mean, it's to various degrees, of course. There might be some governments that have been in power in the world that have no redeeming qualities whatsoever. But that to me goes back again to Jesus saying, everybody loves, everybody's got something, everybody has a sin they don't do. What about you? What about my kingdom? My kingdom is even more different than that. Even the love that I have is different than the love of the world. In Colossians, Paul wrote to the Colossians, and in chapter 1, he said that they've been transferred, in verse 113, that they've been transferred into the kingdom of God's Son. And the English word for transfer is to transpose, to transfer, the Greek, or to remove from one place to another. We have been literally removed from one place to another. We have been removed from the world and placed into his kingdom. Now, of course, it's not a physical kingdom. So me being a physical person with physical skin and nerves that feel things and my senses that see things, I can see that physically I live on the planet Earth in a country called the United States of America. And I could sense and read and learn that it has laws and ways of life that I need to comply with. Otherwise, I might find myself in trouble and in jail or in debt to the government after getting in trouble enough and getting tickets and everything else. That's where I am. That's the same place that Jesus left the disciples when he was praying to his Father in John 17 and saying, I'm not of the world, they're not of the world, but I'm going to leave them in the world. Not so that they could still be attached to it or back to being attached to it. Jesus is saying they can't go have jobs and they can't have a house. He's saying they still need to live in the way that I've taught them to live so that people know that they belong to my kingdom, a different kingdom. And I've taken them from one place and put them into another. And so therefore, we as believers need to examine within ourselves how far, and I think this is not just a question for us. I think Christ is looking at us. He's with us, right? God is with us. And I think they look at us and they wonder, how far are they willing to go? How far are they in my kingdom? What is holding them back? How can I work in them and draw them out more and more and more until they understand that, yes, they're here, and yes, they need to work so they can eat and take care of themselves, but the rest of it, it's not for them. They need to be concerned about me and my kingdom, not about the worldly concerns. Later in the same letter, I think it's in chapter 2, he says, of course, he's referring to the Jewish laws and Gnostic rules and regulations, but he says, you're dead to the elemental things of the world. And of course, the world he's referring to there is religious rules and regulations. But we need to take something like that and say, I am dead to the world around me. And so he asked them, if you're dead to it, through Jesus Christ, if you're dead to it, why do you keep going back to it? Why do you think you need to keep going back? Why? That's the question he asks. And that's where I'm going to leave it for this evening. I told you it would be simple, so hopefully it was.